Hello, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing, channel where I share my experiences prepping and playing tabletop role-playing games. This is the third in a series where I talk about the Sentinels of Justice, which is a superhero game that I'm running using the Champions Now rules. Champions Now, of course, is the superhero role-playing game written by Ron Edwards and published by Hero Games. In this specific installment, I'll be discussing what happens after you give the players the two statements that one gives them to start off a Champions Now game. And really, what happens next is that you wait to receive the gift of their character concepts, which is developed by them responding to the two statements in kind of a brainstorming session. But before we jump into that process, let me remind you of the two statements that I used to kick off this particular campaign. And here they are. They were strange powers, wondrous technology, and two fisted justice blaze in the shadows, and fighting depression and supremacy in late 1930s New York City. So I presented these two statements to my players, along with a reminder that they should be making heroes that will ultimately be, or that will be members of a team from the get go of the campaign. And then I also gave them the following: the three corners sheet. And this is a worksheet that they will use to brainstorm their characters, right? Their heroes. They're going to read the two statements, think about how they interpret those two statements, and then as a response to the two statements, as they interpret them, they will then fill out this three-corner sheet with some phrases that will begin to sketch out their character before they actually sit down and build the character mechanically on a character sheet or on a worksheet that then goes to a character sheet, right? So if we take a quick look at this three-corner sheet, you'll see a few things. First, I have a section where I write out the sentence, or I type out the sentence, the statements, for them to have those statements in front of them as they're working on the sheet so they can focus on them that much more. Then you see three boxes. The first of those boxes is one for powers. And in this space, the player should be writing short descriptive phrases that describe their powers. Now, I don't mean describe them mechanically, right? There should be no mechanical rules related language in on this sheet. Rather, the players at this point should be describing the special effects that describe the powers in the fiction of the game. More specifically, they should be maybe thinking like comic book artists and thinking about how the powers look on the page, what colors they might have, how they express themselves, and what effects they might have on the environment that's depicted in a panel, what they look like when they're using them to have a specific effect, right? So, really, at this point, they should be um, you know, almost doing like a character sketch, but in words, right? The second box down here is the person box, and this is where they will begin to again just provide a few brief descriptive lines about what the hero, the person who has the powers, is like. What is their gender? What is their ethnicity? What is their race? What is their profession? What is their personality? What are their drives and motivations? Those sorts of things, right? What are their interests? Those sorts of things. Let that person kind of come to life with a few descriptive phrases. And then finally, we have the third box, which is the problems box. And here, the player should be um, defining some issues that the character has to contend with. Maybe those emerge from their personality. Maybe they have a temper that it's difficult to control in certain situations. Maybe they have a real passion for something that manifests as a type of compulsion. Maybe they have a relationship that is thorny or problematic in some way. Maybe they have somebody in their life that's constantly inserting themselves into their everyday life and therefore might get in the way of their superhero career or in some way become a target of somebody else in their life. Maybe they have an identity that they're trying to hide, or maybe they have a celebrity status that they have to contend with, right? The list goes on and on and on. And of course, those problems can also emerge from their powers. Maybe there's something about having the powers that they have that cause them some sort of physical or mental problems that they have to contend with. Or maybe the fact that they have powers has been noticed by organizations which are now focusing their attention on them. Or maybe they use their powers in a way that offended somebody or harmed somebody. And now that somebody who might have powers themselves is coming after the heroes in some way, right? So these are the things, these problems are the things that the hero will be about in play, right? And another thing, the fact that this is a worksheet in some ways is meant to keep you from writing some sort of overwrought character backstory, right? The idea is that the character can come to life with a few brief impressions and they're ready for play. And then the development that happens is not something that happens in a pre written story, but rather something that happens through play. So there you have it. That's what the three corner sheet is. I gave my player the two statements along with the three corner sheet. I sent them off to do their thing. And then I had time. I had actually few months to wait before my players came back with a gift for a number of life reasons that were out of my control and out of their control. But there is some stuff that I did during that time, right? Initially, I was tempted to do nothing, just to sit back and wait for the gift. Because in Champions now, the lion's share of building the world happens through the contributions of the players, right? The GM has some role in that, but really it's the gift that you're receiving are what lays out the basics of the world that you're going to be playing in, or the game that you're going to be playing in. But in talking to Ron, it became apparent that it would be a good idea for me to do a little bit of prep, right? To so that I could bring something to the table too, to have to be in conversation with what the players brought. It was a way I thought of kind of conditioning and focusing my mind around the campaign and just getting inspired. So what did I do while I waited? Well, first, I built Orion. That's the character that's featured on the screen right now, and I built him using the two statements, right? He is a villain, right? And so I kind of interpreted the two statements from the villain's perspective and ended up with a villain that I thought I'd be able to drop into the campaign, um, you know, uh, in response to whatever the players might come up with. But I didn't want to go much further than one character. So then I started focusing on the supremacy angle of my two statements. And I started researching. I knew about the German American Bund, but I wanted to start researching fascist and proto fascist and white supremacist organizations of the 1930s because I knew I wanted them to be villains in my game. And in doing that, I found the Silver Legion of America, which is so over the top and so disturbing that they would make a perfect sort of villainous organization for this game. So I found a book about the founder of the Silver Legion of America and the Silver Legion itself, and I read it cover to cover. And I didn't then go and turn that into campaign notes. I just let that information sit in the back of my head so that I can draw inspiration from it later on. And then I started watching documentary after documentary about the Great Depression, specifically related to New York City. I started watching documentaries on Harlem during the 1930s. I I picked up a copy of Stud Terkel's Hard Times, which is an oral history of the Great Depression, and I started finding all of the entries that mentioned New York City and reading those to get the Depression kind of in my mind. And then I started reading 19 comic books from the late 1930s and early 1940s to reacquaint myself with the style of story and the types of story and the type of issues that were being that were in vogue at that time. So basically, it was just read, 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 make one character, and then just be ready to receive whatever the player threw at me. So here it is. Now we're going to dive into what they provided me, what the gifts that they brought me, right? The first person to respond was my friend, Jen. And here is her three-corner sheet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the three-corner sheet first, and then I'm going to talk about my reactions to the three-corner sheets. And by the way, when I share my reactions, in a sense, it's to make my thinking transparent for the purpose of examining my thinking. I don't always think that my initial reactions to these things are the best. They're just my reactions. Um, so I want to think about what I'm doing well and what I could do better. And so I'm just being very transparent. So don't take my reactions as some sort of judgment of the sheets. They're just what was going on in my mind. Okay, so here is her three-corner sheet. Jen told me that her character could hover or fly, that she has fire effects, flames from hands, possibly a breath weapon. The color scheme are reds and oranges, and that her potential name is Spitfire. She, for the person, says that she was born and raised in Texas. She won a singing competition and the opportunity to come to New York City. She's an aspiring performer, which necessitates a secret identity, Jen feels. And she's been in New York for a few months. She loves it and she never wants to leave. She has five older brothers who insist on calling her Lizzie, whereas she prefers to be called Eliza. And she has bright red hair. Her full name is Liza Goodwin. And then, if we go to the problem section, she writes powers can be difficult to control rather, when she's angry. This is especially true when she is dealing with the patriarchy, right? With some sort of male supremacy, and she also gets very angry when anybody's being treated unfairly, especially innocents. Um, she has family pressure to return back to Texas, to go home and marry a nice boy, for she has no interest in Texas or nice boys. In fact, not really any boys, right? And she's relatively young, 19. So, that's young to be independent and living in New York so far from family. So that might draw some unwanted attention. So here was my initial reaction to what Jen offered me in her three-corner sheet. I loved that the powers were simple but fun, and they certainly blaze in the shadows, right? They are light. They are fire powers, so they certainly blaze in the shadows. I will say though that if they had just been just fire powers, I might have been less excited about them. I might have thought that they were a little bit basic, but the fact that she specified that she might have a breath weapon, I thought was so evocative and so cool, and so different that I got very excited just about that little detail in the powers box. A breath weapon, right? Cool. I the fact that she's an aspiring performer made me think about the Federal Theater Project, which is a part of the WPA, and I know that there was a very active federal theater in New York City, and that gives me a little bit of a window to hook her character into like a whole theater subculture and a whole depression era situation where you have aspiring not just actors but writers and directors and all sorts of folks who are trying to make it, and there's a neat community that she can plug into there. So I thought that all of that would be cool in the long run. I love that she has issues very specifically with the patriarchy. Now she does have a broader empathy for an impulse to protect innocence in general. But I love that that has also a very specific expression that she cares about more, and that is when women are oppressed in some way, right? So that makes her somewhat distinct in a way. And again, definitely deals with issues of supremacy, right? Now, this is not the kind of supremacy that I was emphasizing in my mind. It was certainly in the realm of things that I thought possible to work with, but it's not the stuff that I was emphasizing most in my mind. So I love that she has added that as a major aspect of the way that supremacy worked in this campaign, and that she's gonna be fighting against that, right? Also, I don't know how far Jen intends to take this, but the fact that she says that she doesn't have really any interest in boys at all leads me to suspect that Eliza Goodwin slash Spitfire might be taking some strong stances regarding, sexual orientation in the campaign. Maybe she will, maybe she won't. I don't know. But the fact that that's another kind of aspect of, you know, the way that supremacy might work in the campaign and the way that one might resist certain restrictive norms could be a part of this game, and that's fantastic. I'm really pleased with that. And then, again, the more broad distaste for unfair treatment of innocence is going to be very helpful just in general, in terms of the character caring about the things that are going to be coming up in Depression era America. So my reaction to this was very positive, and I was instantly excited when I saw this. You know, it enhanced what I was doing, and yet also connected with what I wanted to do. Both are true. So the next person to respond was my friend Dan, one of my oldest friends. We've been playing together for over 40 years. And here is his first draft. And the fact that it's his first draft tells you that there was at least a second, right? So let me read it first, and then we'll go through my reaction. Powers: arcane magic, avatar of god slash goddess of justice. Person: archaeologist, intelligent, brave, working as a day laborer on skyscrapers, has unyielding sense of equality. Problems: mixed marriage, laid off from teaching position due to depression. So here were my initial reactions. Um, Before I read my first reaction that I just put up here, let me explain what I think triggered this reaction, and let me also say that I am not particularly um proud of my reaction. I mean, I'm not beating myself up for it, but when I'm thinking about what best practices are in terms of setting up a game, I think that I maybe had the wrong reaction here. Let me explain what I mean, or why that happened. So the first things I read on the sheet were arcane magic. And again, I've been playing with Dan for 40 years, and superhero comics have never been his thing, but he's watched a lot of superhero media, especially animated series and stuff like that. And he does know superhero comics, and he's played a ton of superhero games because we're close friends, and and I love running superhero games. So he's done that. And like a lot of us who play games, we have certain kind of defaults that we fall back on, and we sometimes fall back on defaults when, I don't know, when maybe we're just going through the motions, or maybe whatever, maybe we're just not inspired and we just go to something that we know or something that we like. And I know that Dan's one of Dan's defaults, right, is in superhero gaming is a character like Dr. Fate, or maybe like Zatanna. A character who basically, because they are a wizard of some sort, have access to almost any power, or really any power, right? This bag of everything kind of approach to superhero gaming. And I I didn't I didn't want this to be kind of a campaign where people defaulted to, leaned on the defaults or went to their defaults. I wanted them to really think about the two statements and respond to them. It doesn't mean that I didn't want them to respond with things that they like. Of course I want them to do that, but I guess I was afraid that when I saw arcane magic, I'm like, Dan might be making the same character that he's made in every other superhero game. And I think if he were to consider the two statements, like really think about them and consider and build on it, that he might develop the idea more before presenting it. And I say this now, realizing that maybe that was very, very unfair because right under Arcane Magic, he also had Avatar of God slash Goddess of Justice. So that is different than the other stuff that he usually makes. And so maybe he was aiming for something that was more specific and he just didn't express it here, right? But, another thing is that when I saw this, I didn't see much about, I mean, I saw a little bit about the Great Depression in terms of working as a day laborer on skyscrapers and having lost his teaching position due to the Depression. But I didn't see anything about supremacy here, not overtly anyway. And even the stuff that kind of nodded at the Great Depression didn't manifest in terms of like dealing with the Great Depression beyond just, uh, having lost a job that he no longer has and all. And so I just kind of felt like it wasn't thought through as much as it could have been. So what was my response to that? I sent him this super long, detailed email that asked a whole bunch of questions that were not aimed at steering him away from a concept necessarily, but that was asking him to dig more deeply. And these are just some of the things that I said in this email. So, a god, huh? What kind of god? What does the magic do? What are some specific powers that you might define that are attached to this concept? I mean, this, I guess I was steering him away from a bag of everything. I was like, avoid variable power pools. If you want to make a character that can do anything, you're going to have to have a variable power pool. And if you have a variable power pool, you're going to be building powers during play, and you don't know the system that well. You don't, you need help with the mechanics. And as a game master, I can't be helping you with the mechanics. So maybe you don't want to start out with a variable power pool. Can you think of more specific powers that you think would be cool for this character? And you define those on the sheet? What about the background and the profession? I get that he was formerly an archaeologist. Does that match with the background that you have where he's now building, he's now a day laborer, building skyscrapers? A lot of that actually doesn't make sense in the context of the Great Depression. If you think of the history, academics didn't tend to lose their jobs due to layoffs and stuff like that during the Great Depression. Sometimes they took pay cuts, but it wasn't a profession that as a profession was impacted in that particular way by the Great Depression. So I was like providing some um feedback on historical context and saying like, if you are going to have this setup, can we have it, can we have it make sense? Can we elaborate a little bit and think about it? What are the problems? I felt the problems were very thin. What problems do you see coming out of the powers? What problems do you see coming out of their situations? What are the things that they're going to be wrestling with and dealing with? What is that mixed marriage? Why is that mixed marriage problematic? Right. So I was just kind of going on. I was giving, like I said, that advice on historical context, like, with regards to the academics, like I already said. So I was saying basically dig deeper, develop this further, work on it more until a hero emerges on the page. And the email is so long. And I posted it over on Adept Play, which is the, Ron Edwards' site celebrating role playing as an art form. And I posted it there for people to consider, and to give me feedback on whether the email was too much. And I got a couple of comments that were like, "Hey, it seems like you're a really supportive, GM, and that you were guiding your players." And I was grateful for the affirmation, but I was also kind of thinking like, like this, I really shouldn't be guiding them. I don't want to be guiding them. I certainly don't want to be steering them to specific character concepts and all that. Like part of me was saying, like, in that email, I kind of broke it. I broke this system. I broke the process, but I wasn't sure. And then it was Ron Edwards who responded on that other, thread on Add It Play, and he's like, "I think you did. I think you did go too far. I think you were trying to nail everything down." And Ron said, like, this sheet that Dan gave you, for me, that would have been enough. And I think he went on to say, like, it's not that you shouldn't have mentioned all these things that you mentioned in the email, but maybe not at this stage. Maybe those are conversations that you have as you both sit down to build the character, together. Like when you're expressing this concept on a worksheet and a character sheet, maybe that's where you have some of these make some of these observations and have a dialogue about it rather than just blasting somebody with an email that is this long list of suggestions about how to go deeper. And in the end, I kind of agree with Ron's assessment, right? Um, Now, Dan didn't complain about my feedback, not at all. In fact, what he did is very quickly fire back a second three-corner sheet, and here it is. So let's look at this one. So powers. He is imbued with magic from Ma'at, the Egyptian goddess of truth, justice, law, balance, and cosmic order. When in hero form, he is sort of like Hawkman in appearance. He wears a helmet that has an ostrich feather motif from the ridge of the nose and sweeping back. He wears a leather harness and Egyptian kilt with sandaled feet. Sprouting from his back are large vulture wings. He wears a necklace with an ankh on it. One particular power he has is the ability to look into the eyes of someone and weigh their heart against Ma'at's feather and know the truth. He can fly with his wings and fights with a magic mace mace slash scepter. For the person he wrote, archaeologist, intelligent, brave, has an unyielding sense of equality. His sense of fairness and equality has gotten him into a bit of trouble in as a rabble rouser with his standing up for the underdog, usually siding with the minority students. He has always stood up for those being bullied and has a habit of judging someone on their character and not on their appearance. And then finally, for the problems, mixed marriage. He is a white man who married an Egyptian woman. Her father was an archaeologist from Egypt, whom he mentored with. She was a bookstore owner in Egypt, specializing in Egyptology, always wanting to follow in her father's footsteps, but was looked down upon and hindered from scholarly pursuits. They moved to America because of his pursuit of becoming a professor and her scholarly dream. Soon the depression hit and he took a salary cut. However, as much as he tried, his wife was forced out of the school and continues to be unacceptable to the other professors' wives. So, okay, so that was the second sheet that Dan gave me. And here are my reactions to it. The supportive professor and underdog angles on the three-corner sheet tug at the depression era aspect of the second statement, right? So there's something there, in the same way that WPA, you know, theater kind of connection gives Spitfire kind of a community of people who are going to be impacted by the depression in several ways, and she's going to care about them and that community. We have the same thing here for Just a Card, but with an academic setting instead. So that's interesting. That's cool. Um, I think that the supremacy angle isn't particularly evident here, unless he was thinking about just the law and order kind of thing that Ma'at represents. But I just don't see the supremacy angle here. And Dan was the player who was like, what do you mean by supremacy? And I didn't give an answer. I said, well, I don't know. What do you mean about supremacy? So maybe he's just like, look, I don't have any ideas about that. And so I'm just going to focus on the depression angle and go with that. Which is fine. I don't know that the statements require that everything on the statements is responded to, especially in statements like mine that gave like multiple options, right, to some degree. So I think that's fine. But the fact maybe it's because the supremacy angle is not there, and maybe it's because the stands up for the underdog thing is a little broad, although the minority student thing is there. I don't know. Something about Justicar seems like at this stage in his creation, he seemed less hitched to the statements or less of a response to the statements in Spitfire was. And I didn't complain about that. I didn't say anything about that. I just kind of noted it. It was an observation that I had, and I started wondering about why that might be the case. And I asked myself the question: is it that genre tropes are kind of getting in the way, right? Like again, Dan's somebody who's played in a lot of superhero games that I've run. Dan is somebody who's maybe a little. I don't know if he's more immersed than Jen in the genre. I'm not, or in the idiom or in the genre. I'm not sure, but I guess I started to wonder if either genre tropes or again some of those default habits that we develop as players kind of like took control of his process um and uh prevented him from maybe just fully considering the statements. I'm not sure. It was just something that I asked myself. um One thing on the sheet that I noticed though, and that I started wondering if there was an interesting conflict there, was that, Maat um has a sense of law, balance, and cosmic order, and justice and truth. And he is more about, I don't know, judging people on their own merits. And I started to wonder if there might be kind of a disagreement between Dylan and Ma'at. I didn't know exactly what Dan was thinking about, but I do remember when I saw this, I'm like, oh, I'm wondering if there's something there. And if there is, that would be interesting. Let's see what happens when he makes the character. So that's Dan's second three corner sheet. And I said, thank you very much. We'll work this out when we build the character together. And then we're going to go to the next three corner sheet, which came from my wife, Lauren. Now, let's just read through hers and then I'll reflect on it, right? So here it is. She gave me time powers, stop time, freeze falling glass in place, freeze someone and search them. Some effects seem like super speed because time is slowed or stopped, disappear from one location and appear in another in the blink of an eye. She she said rewind time and she said it as a question. She said, maybe now that sounds you know, like high level. She said like maybe that's something she would get in time, no pun intended. And then, things frozen or slowed down in time look like black and white, like they're in a black and white movie. And I love that. I think that's such a cool visual detail in terms of how her powers manifest. And then she said saw her wearing a domino mask and having kind of like uh, um, uh, a bodysuit of some sort. Um, like Silver Scorpion from the Golden Age. Okay. Then, for the person, she wrote Eastern European immigrant woman, or the child of Eastern European immigrants, maybe Romanian, maybe Hungarian. She said she wanted her to be a journalist, kind of like a Lois Lane type, with short curly brown hair, like Roxy Hart's hair in the movie version of Chicago. He saw her as a community activist, caring specifically about immigrant issues, but more generally, social justice issues. He thought that she might possibly be Jewish, but wasn't entirely sure at the point that she made this character. And then that she is a character who just loves Hollywood movies, right? And yeah, so that's her as a person, and I thought that was cool. And then her for problems, she wrote anxiety about not effectively using her powers to protect loved ones, the community or people in general, angered a slumlord through her journalism and activism, angered a crooked politician, and angered the German American Bund through, or Bund, I don't know, Bund, through her superheroic activity. Okay. So here were my responses to this. First of all, before I talk about my responses, I want to say that we had a slightly different process with Lauren, and not because she's my wife, but rather because she wasn't doing her homework, and for good reasons. She's a teacher like me. She does plenty of just prep for class. And the last thing that she wants to do on a weekend or after work is to sit down and work on a worksheet, right? So she was interested in the campaign, but she just was dragging her feet on actually sitting down and doing that process. So I waited for a day when we're driving up to see her parents, which is a 7 hour drive up in South Georgia. We're down in Miami. And I just opened up my laptop and said, okay, so what were you thinking about in terms of powers? And she just talked. And as she talked, I typed. And then I said, what were you thinking about in terms of person? What were you thinking about in terms of problems? And I just recorded what she said. And then I asked her, like, did you have any ideas for names? And she threw out a bunch. She was kind of brainstorming possible names. And so I just typed what she said. I didn't discuss it with her. I didn't give her affirmation. I didn't give her, I just said, and I told her, I'm just going to record. We'll talk about this later when we make the character, build the character. And so the process was a little different. And I mentioned that because, you can't necessarily always expect to be a purist in terms of the process. You might have to make an accommodation for just somebody who's going to be have I think I was very true to the spirit of the process with Lauren, but we had to go the extra step and just be her scribe so that this would get done. Okay, so here are my responses to her three corner sheet. The expression of depression and supremacy on this matches my own, which is very convenient for me. It wasn't a requirement that any of the characters would have, or any of the players would have interpreted the statements in the same way that I did. But maybe because Lauren and I are both history teachers, both trained specifically in U.S. history, both teach similar courses, both went through the same um, university program, and all of that, um, meant that we were just on the same wavelength. So a lot of what I was thinking, she was thinking, and we didn't discuss it beforehand, right? So that's helpful for me. It reinforces some of the stuff that I was doing during my prep time. And that was nice, but again, it wasn't necessary. I was very excited looking when she said Lois Lane type and a journalist. I was like an investigator, and I didn't know at this time whether or not she was going to put it on her sheet, on her character sheet. But the idea that a detective work skill might appear on her character sheet was exciting to me because that means that this hero, at least, and maybe the hero group, would be a little bit more proactive in terms of staying a step or two ahead of the villains at times, right? So that was cool. And I just thought that the powers were visually interesting and the special effects of the powers were just cool and interesting. So I was looking forward to seeing what would happen when we sat down to build the character. Um, so that one's Lauren's three corner sheet. Now let's go to Mike's three corner sheet. My friend Mike turned in the following powers: electrical gadgets and fists, shoots lightning, roller skates on power lines, taser like effect, maybe a force field. For person, he put guy from Brooklyn or Queens, where the mob is shaking up everybody. He's got no real trade, works for family business, gets together with other people in the neighborhood to fight the mob. One guy trains him to fight, one guy is a wacky inventor that provides him with gadgets, and his uncle covers for him. He's a good egg. And then the problems: mob after him, secret identity important as his friends are in danger. If he's discovered, needs someone to repair his gadgets, work life issues, neighborhood reputation, and both non superhero and superhero identities. Okay. And this was interesting because well, first of all, let me just say Mike also had a different process, and it was the same different process that I had for Lauren. Mike just had a lot going on in his life. He wasn't doing his homework either. And so after one of our Saturday games, I said, "Hey, Mike, before you go, what were you thinking about in terms of powers? What were you thinking about in terms of person?" And I just served as a scribe. I didn't comment on it. I said, "Thank you so much. We'll talk about this later." And then and then that was that. So this is what I thought after I put my pencil down and thought about what he gave me. So I appreciate very much that we have wondrous technology and two-fisted justice all bundled into one character. The other characters gave me a lot of strange powers, right? Um, but here we have this character giving me the wondrous technology and the two-fisted justice. So that was cool. I was put a smile on my face. I like that. Then I'm like the depression aspect. And I ask myself, is it absent? Is this actually a response to that part of the of the statements. And if I squint, I can see it. I think that it is implied the fact that he's a guy that stands up when tough things are happening. Now, he stood up to crime, not specifically to depression era, injustice or difficulty, but he stood, the fact that he would stand up to crime means that he'd probably stand up for just people who are in need, and he's a good egg, right? So I think if I squint, I can see a- an implied response to the depression era stuff there. But it isn't very evident. You have to think about it a little bit, right? And then in terms of the supremacy theme, I ask myself, is it here? I mean, I think one way in which you could say that is here is, of course it's here. The mob is um trying to dominate the community that he lives in. It is um pushing people around, and he's standing up against that kind of supremacy. It's not the kind of supremacy that I was thinking of. I was thinking of more institutionalized supremacy. He interpreted the statement in a different way, potentially, and took it in that direction. And you know what? By doing so, he allows me to bring in crime bosses and stuff like that in a way that's far more direct and still be exploring the certain types of supremacy, right? So that's cool. It works. But I am a teacher, and I know that sometimes I'll give my students an essay prompt, and I know that they'll write an essay, and I know that sometimes they write an essay that doesn't respond to the prompt. I know that sometimes my students ignore prompt. And so I started asking the question here: did Mike ignore the prompt? Did he imply the Depression era stuff, or am I reading that into what he wrote? Did he mean for the mob to be an expression of supremacy or a type of supremacy? Or am I reading that into his choice? So is it that it's just different than what I was thinking of? It's there, but it's different? Or is it that it's actually absent from his process? And I am then reading what he produced and reading the statements into what he produced. And I don't know the answer to that. I haven't talked to Mike about it. I don't know what its thought process was. I suspect that he did mean to imply it. I suspect that this is his interpretation of supremacy. And so it's probably just working the way it's supposed to work. But I guess the my wondering whether or not he just ignored the prompt, so to speak, right? And just did his own thing, which he might have done, right? Does it matter? If I'm gonna take what he gave me and kind of use filter it through the two statements and see the two statements in it, does it matter that he didn't respond? And I don't know the answer to that. I just think it's an interesting question. Um, you know, um, so at some point I'm gonna talk to Mike about, just out of curiosity, like what was going on in your mind when you were thinking about this. And I'm going to talk to Dan too, because I had questions about Dan's process as well. And again, um, I think maybe my questioning of Mike's process might have to do with my understanding that Mike actually has a very deep knowledge of comic books, deeper than my own, that he is kind of a stickler for genre, and that he is a fan of comic books, and he has you know, a sense of how the genre should work. And Champions Now is a game that does away with genre. It's interested in idiom, right? But it's not interested in the narrowing of an idiom into like a, a more mm, a more specific and restrictive definition of what a superhero is, right? So maybe my sense that Mike cares about genre and that he might have just ignored the statements and gone just with a character that he felt lined up with the genre might have gotten in the way of him just embracing the process in a more open way. So I don't know. I'll get that all straightened out. Maybe at some point I'll do if they are willing, maybe I could kind of hash it out with them in kind of interview format for this channel. Who knows? So, with that, we are about to come to a close. Um, I've shown you the three corner sheets for all the characters. The characters in the campaign ended up being Spitfire, Justicar, Silver Spectre, and Major Shocker, right? And we've now played 3 sessions, and it's going great. I'm going to continue to create videos that talk about the various steps involved. My next video will be just showing you their character sheets and talking about how that process went. And then I have a few more processes that I'll discuss before I start talking about our sessions. But as I'm about to wrap up, let's just say that I was, at the end of this process, I was thinking about a few questions, right? First, I asked myself, am I intruding on the process too much or too little? And for the most part, I think I got it just right, except in the case of Dan. If I have to assess myself in the end, I would say that I did intrude too much in that process when I sent that big blast of an email. I don't think I intruded so much that I broke the process. I ultimately I was just saying, dig deeper, man. And I would have had that conversation with him anyway when we sat down to build the character. I never I never said you can't make anything, and I didn't try to push him in any specific direction. So I don't feel like I was guiding him through, but I was just encouraging him to dig more deeply. If I had to do it to do all over again, I would not have sent that email. I would have just worked with what he sent me. I think Ron was right about that. Am I prepping too much or too little beforehand? Is a question I had going into this process. I certainly didn't prep um, too much. I feel like I did do a lot of reading, but I didn't take what I read about the period and about the place and start world building with it. I was just cramming my head with as much real world information as I could about the setting and letting it sit in the back of my mind to serve as inspiration. And I made one villain. And the villain that I made was um, very much oriented to the two statements, but I knew was flexible enough that he would work in a variety of different ways. And it ended up that he ended up in a nice conversation with the heroes in some ways. At some point maybe I can get to that, right? But so I didn't prep too much and I didn't prep too little either. I felt like the type of prep I did was the exact type of prep that I did, and it was it was robust. It was robust, and it set me up for success, right? It set me up for success, and it became helpful when we sat down to build the characters. I had a reservoir of things that I could say, hey, would this work for your character based on what you said here? Would this work for your character? Would that work for your character? And that was good. So and then, am I engaging my players in ways that promote good play, or am I exhibiting habits that would do otherwise? That's another question I asked over at Add Play. And again, I think the only place that I questioned myself was in that case with Dan, and I don't think that I broke the game or the process. So so far so good. I'm pretty confident about it now because we've played 3 sessions and it's gone extremely well so far. The experiment is still ongoing, but it's gone extremely well so far. The players are all very, very invested at this point. So I'm confident now, but at the time that I finished this process and jotted down these questions for myself, I was a little bit unsure, right? I was a little bit unsure. So anyway, those are my reflections on receiving the gift. I share them in case anybody is wants to go through this process and is just interested. I hope they're helpful and useful to somebody. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. If you're interested, come back soon to look at the character sheets for these 4 characters. Until then, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. And I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.